It's the vast majority. I'm Jacobin managing editor Micah Uetricht. Thank you for tuning in. We're recording this podcast on Wednesday, April 8th, the day that Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the race for the Democratic nomination for president. It's a rough day for many of us who have really thrown ourselves into the Bernie campaign and crazily enough maybe believed that he could actually become President of the United States. We could become the most powerful person in the entire world. And the just wild, oscillations between thinking that Bernie never stood a chance and then the primaries kicking off and Bernie actually winning several of them, leading us to believe that actually maybe Bernie could sweep this thing to this point where we are now wrestling with what it will mean to live in a world, yet again, as we did after 2016, a world where Bernie Sanders is not running for president and likely will not be running again. It's a bit of a feeling of whiplash, trying to get our head around it. And I wanted to get a kind of immediate read on this moment from two people who have been both observers and participants in this movement. Marianela D'Aprile, who is an elected member of the Democratic Socialists of America's National Political Committee, and Eric Blanc, who has been on this podcast before. He's a regular contributor to Jacobin, author of the book Red State Revolt, and a surrogate for Bernie during the 2020 campaign, traveling with the campaign all over the country. And before I get to that discussion, do have to mention it feels a little mercenary on the same day that Bernie is dropping out of the race, but Megan Day and I wrote a book, which you probably know about if you're a regular listener to this podcast. It's called Bigger Than Bernie: How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. And it's a book that we wrote because we feel that we have been given a really once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transform American politics. It's an opportunity that's been opened up from Bernie Sanders himself. We now know, of course, that Bernie will not be our figurehead in the White House, but he has opened up a wide range of possibilities that we really can seize if we choose to in this moment. And we tried to write a book that could speak to people who were inspired by the Bernie campaign and want to know what we should be doing next. So that book is still for sale for 40% off at the versobooks.com website, as well as available for $12.95 at jacobinmag.com/store. It's a book that we tried to make relevant to the current moment and to the kind of questions that we are wrestling with in this discussion that I had with Marianela D'Aprile and with Eric Blanc. Here's our discussion. Marianela and Eric, welcome.
Hi, Micah.
Hey, good to be on.
So let's just start from the base level. How are you guys feeling upon today's news?
I feel like I should pretend to be really positive to psych everybody up for the fight, because I know that's politically accurate, but the truth is, on a personal level, today was shitty.
Yeah, today sucked, I think. I actually, someone texted me the press release that Bernie was dropping out, and I audibly just I didn't scream, but I exclaimed like, no, I was just by myself. And I think that has just been my state for the rest of the day. I'm pretty angry, I think, is my baseline.
How are you, Micah?
Well, I've been all day in what some of the kids call squid mode, just working nonstop the whole day on this news, and I think using that constant work to try to not process my feelings, my true feelings, my innermost feelings about the Sanders, the end of the Sanders campaign. Although, yeah, maybe we'll get the real stuff here, because I give up drinking for Lent every year, and the onset of COVID-19 couldn't drive me to the bottle, but today, just before the end of the Bernie Sanders campaign did drive me back right before the end of Lent. So maybe you'll get some tears by the end of this this podcast.
I already got my cry out today, so I'm doing okay now.
So I mean, let's, we can start at the most base level here. I mean, Marianela, you mentioned that you are angry upon hearing today's news. Why is that? What are you angry about? Who are you angry at?
I think I probably need a couple more days to like fully unpack that question. But I think the thing that made me really angry today is that it felt like just such an impossible situation, both for the Bernie campaign to be in and for the left to be in. And I think the thing that had me the most angry is that I still had yesterday's elections in Wisconsin like fresh on my mind, and just like the murderous nature of the fact that those elections still took place yesterday, even after so much back and forth and so much work to get them postponed, and decisions on both, the part of the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin to still hold them, and the U.S. Supreme Court as well to deny an extension of the mail-in ballot. And I was just so extremely angry at that, at the willingness of the ruling class to put so many working class lives in danger, and simultaneously like decimate democracy. And so I was already mad about that, I think. And then on top of all of that, Bernie dropped out. And I think the reason too is that I was angry is that it seems to me like his dropping out is at least partially, and I don't know, we can talk about this, right? But I think it's at least partially a response to this impossible moment where, like, how is anyone supposed to campaign? How's anyone supposed to, in good faith and good conscience, ask people to go vote for them when going out means putting your life in danger? So it just felt like sort of insurmountable odds the whole time, but over the last few days, it's felt even more so. And I got really agitated. I think I'm still agitated.
Eric, you wrote in the article that you published in Jacobin today that it makes sense that people would want to start assigning blame. And we're already, within hours of the announcement, within minutes of the announcement, hearing some levels of blame being apportioned here and there. Do you think that's like where we should be expending our efforts right now, or to what extent, I guess the question is, should we be talking about blame, and to what extent should we be angry, and then to what extent should we just be like taking a zoomed out sort of bigger picture about what was accomplished in this campaign?
Yeah, I mean, specifically what I was trying to push back on there was this idea that there was like one quick fix, and if the Bernie campaign had just done this one thing, we so definitely would have won, right? And everybody has their different idea of what that thing would have been, which is one of the reasons why you should be a little distrustful of that line of argument. And I just don't actually think that's the case. So I don't think the blame should be first and foremost directed at the Bernie campaign for tactical mistakes. And there's a lot of stuff in hindsight we could talk about. But the big story, I do think, is basically it's amazing that we got this far. And the reason it hurts me personally, and I think for a lot of us, is that we got our expectations raised so high. I mean, to be honest, when the whole campaign was starting, I think a lot of us understood what we still, I think, intellectually understood the whole time, that this was a real long shot. The idea that somehow we'd be able to elect a democratic socialist in the absence of a strong working class movement is just such a hard thing to wrap your head around. But what happened after Nevada when we won, there was like this brief moment when it seemed like we had a clear path to the White House, right? And I let myself believe that, which I hadn't up until that moment. I let myself really start like daydreaming about what the hell it would look like to have a
You were trying not to have your heart get broken, but then you fell in love at that moment again.
That's exactly right. There's that Neil Young song, Only Love Can Break Your Heart. And I feel like that's actually what happened. And it is really sad. I mean, but it's, so many people were so invested because they understood that electing Bernie would have changed the course of U.S. and possibly world history down a radically better track. And then, so what I just feel like right now is like we're in the bad timeline. It's like this nightmare world that isn't the world we should be living in. And I know in some ways that's unfair because it was such a long shot for Bernie to have won it. But it still feels like I just kind of want to wake up and live in the world where Bernie's winning and we're about to take power.
Right. I mean, it is worth mentioning, as you said, just how much of a long shot this was. I mean, we know how weak the left was pre-Bernie, how weak the left still is today, how weak the organized labor movement is today. And it's almost like because of how weak all of those institutions in American life were before Bernie, maybe that is what allowed us to make this what felt like this enormous leap. We were going to go from 0 to 100, basically. We were going to go from total stagnation and irrelevance of the left in America to a democratic socialist in the White House. And what, we all know of all the things that have popped off in recent years before Bernie, whether it's the Occupy Wall Street or the Wisconsin uprising or the Chicago Teachers Union strike in 2012. All of these things were popping off, and they were expressions of this organic anger about the conditions of inequality and austerity and all of the rest of it in this society. And what would have been a more normal situation would have been the emergence of a figure like Elizabeth Warren to kind of collect some of that roiling progressive energy, right? But then put it in a sort of safe direction, like in an electoral direction that wouldn't totally be completely threatening to the Democratic Party establishment and to capital and to all the other villains in society. I mean, that would have been the more typical way we would expect something like this to go, that a sort of opportunistic person like Warren comes along and can capture some of that energy. But instead, what we got was a real ass democratic socialist, a dude who used to say stuff like, we should abolish the CIA and we should take over, we should nationalize oil companies, and the dude is one of us. He is an actual socialist, and yeah, we kind of got to the point where we were just like, oh yeah, this is just how it's gonna go. Like, of course it makes sense that Bernie Sanders is vying for literally the most powerful position in the entire world. But now that he's out, and the sort of post South Carolina, post Super Tuesday reality set in, it just sort of like feels like, oh, as Eric was saying, maybe we shouldn't have allowed ourselves to fall in love and then get our hearts broken in this way. But it sort of, in hindsight, makes some sense.
Yeah, I think I want to question or maybe like interrogate this idea that like maybe things would have just sort of like naturally fallen to the way of like Elizabeth Warren, or like that was like the natural representation of where politics could have evolved to. And I think, we had already been there, right? I think that like sense of like a middle progressive being represented in electoral politics had like already come and gone with Barack Obama. And so right. I think that like actually Bernie was like extremely, and his campaign were just extremely representative of the polarization that's happened in the American political landscape.
Yeah, and not just that. I felt this very strongly when I was in Iowa knocking doors for Bernie, that I would knock on people's doors and give them the pitch about Bernie. And they were people who were not super invested in politics, didn't pay very close attention, but I gave them the Bernie pitch about Medicare for all and everything else. And it wasn't that they didn't agree that we needed those things. It was almost like they didn't believe that winning those things was possible. And like the Obama campaign both opened up the space for people like us to, millions of other people, especially young people, to want to go beyond the kind of empty liberalism that we saw in the Obama campaign. But the Obama campaign also destroyed people's capacity to even believe that politics could transform their lives, because their hopes had been raised so high by Obama, and then Obama didn't deliver. And so they're like, well, then fuck it. Like, I'm not,
a series of expectations being raised and then immediate disappointments. And I think what's different about the Bernie campaign is that expectations were raised, and we have seen some victories along the way. Eric, I wonder like what you think about this, but I think in terms of just working class activity and working class militancy, that to me is a victory in and of itself. And I think those things would not have been possible had it not been for both this Bernie campaign and the last one.
Yeah, I think the big point that you raised, Micah and Marianela, is that there is still this disconnect between what people want policy-wise and then what they actually believe is feasible or worth investing time and energy into. And ultimately, I do think that was the big obstacle that we came up against, because obviously the Democratic Party and the corporate media is going to try to destroy Bernie. Like we actually knew that was going to be the case. The big sort of X factor was whether beyond, people who are already committed Bernie folks, how far could we activate working class people after, it's not just Obama, really decades of neoliberalism, atomization, labor movement defeat, right? So the sad reality is that we made it far, but not far enough, right? It's not like it was just the existing left was activated. It's actually, amazing that Bernie won California, 40% of the Democratic Party electorate, was willing to ignore literally everything that those in power told him to do and side with us. But the reality is there was, I think, a majority of the Democratic primary electorate that just didn't really believe, based on their experience, that something better was worth fighting for. It's not that they were against it. They, all the polls show people support Medicare for all, et cetera. But there was still this just sense of powerlessness ultimately. And I don't think we can just overnight make that change. That being said, as Marianela mentioned, there is a process of working class recomposition and insurgency that began, in some ways before Bernie, but that Bernie certainly spurred with the, teacher strikes and just generally raising people's expectations and giving a sense that you could fight. So I think the big question now is the extent to which the Bernie campaign's legacy will be the folks who were inspired by his message continuing to fight. And that's, remains to be seen.
Yeah. So Eric, can you just talk about that a little bit? I mean, if we're going to be doing a kind of overview autopsy of the campaign, you have written at length in a book and many times in Jacobin about the red state teachers strike wave, as well as the teacher strike wave that extended beyond red states. This is something that you've been one of the only ones to kind of beat the drum on, that not only did the Bernie Sanders campaign achieve all these things in terms of, we already know that it's helped make Medicare for all the American people are overwhelmingly in favor of Medicare for all, according to many polls. People have had their minds changed about the whole idea of democratic socialism, and all those kind of policy questions, things that are quantifiable in surveys. But then there are also what socialists would call a working class self-activity. I mean, there's the teacher strike wave. There's right now, in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, people are going on strike in massive numbers outside of the the trade union apparatus. They're like just deciding to organize strikes with their coworkers at companies like Instacart and Whole Foods and elsewhere. So can you just talk about how you see the campaign the Bernie Sanders campaign interacting with that kind of working class self-activity with strikes and that kind of worker activity?
Right. The big story is that Bernie, unlike any candidate of the Democratic Party establishment, actively encouraged and promoted and legitimized kind of unruly mass activity, right? Calling for support for strikes, saying that strikes are important, other forms of protest. And so part of what that translated into was that supporters of the Bernie campaign in 2016, and then again this time, have played a really integral role in a lot of these strike movements. It's not the case that most workers today or in the teacher strikes were primarily striking because they were inspired by Bernie. It's a little bit more nuanced that what happened is Bernie inspired a core of activists who helped play a leadership role in pushing these strikes to happen and in helping lead them. And so you did see that in West Virginia, in Arizona. A lot of the core strike leaders were first politicized through the Bernie campaign. And it's not a coincidence that, again, now you saw that in the 2020 Bernie campaign, Bernie's number one supporters were teachers, right? So you have this really kind of back and forth reciprocal action between electoral campaigns spurring strikes, which in turn spur like wide levels of teacher activism, which in turn then becomes a base for the Bernie campaign this time. What happened with DSA's emergence, I think, is a similar dynamic. I'm sure Marianela can speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, before we talk about DSA, I just want to finish this point a little bit. So this is something that really, if we're talking about sort of how we go forward from here, what the lessons are of this campaign, what other good left candidates should do in the future based on what we've learned from Bernie. This kind of insistence on working class self-activity and militants and using the campaign apparatus of Bernie campaign, texting supporters, and using rallies to highlight striking workers and turning people out to picket lines and all this stuff that we know that the Bernie campaign did. I mean, this is what sets it apart from this is how you know that somebody is really like about that socialist life, about that bottom up, not me, us life, because they're using their campaign in that way. It's that class struggle elections, which something that the Democratic Socialists of America endorsed last summer. We write about in me and Megan Day's book that is how elections should be done, is to be used to spur more of that kind of activity. And it's if you want a clear example of what sets someone like Bernie away from, apart from a candidate like Elizabeth Warren, that is it. That insistence that it's not just enough to elect me and carry out the good stuff. It is that my campaign has to be used to spur that kind of militant working class activity.
Yeah, and we need to hammer that home right now, because even those of us who understand that got really excited about Bernie winning the election, and we need to hammer on to ourselves and to everybody else. Well, it was never just about that. Even if Bernie had won, his ability to actually have gotten anything passed was going to be almost entirely contingent on this massive eruption from below. And so now it's still the case that winning the types of demands that Bernie popularized is still going to be contingent on what we do in the streets and workplaces.
So one thing that came out of the campaign was this kind of activity that we were just talking about. Another was the rebirth of the American socialist movement. Rebirth that, Marianela, you can tell me if you disagree with me, but I honestly believe that we would not, well, the three of us might not even be here talking to each other. We all three met through the DSA. We would certainly not have a totally reborn, rejuvenated American socialist movement seen through the now nearly 60,000 members of the Democratic Socialists of America if Bernie had not helped detoxify that term socialism. Am I wrong about that? Am I overstating Bernie's role? Would we have all just organically found our way together out of just the sheer magnetism of our own personalities and being correct about politics, or is it true that the Bernie campaign was required to cohere this new socialist movement in America?
Well, I think something was required to cohere this movement, and I think the Bernie campaign is what that was because of its scale and because of its reach, right? I think there are a few things, and we can talk about this more, but I think there are a few things in American political life that have the reach and the scale of presidential elections. And so, yes, I think that it was definitely Bernie's campaign that was a catalyst in that way, because I think, Bernie calls himself and called himself even in 2016 a democratic socialist. And I think people, kind of thought to themselves, well, I identify with what Bernie is saying, then I must be a democratic socialist. Okay, I'm going to kind of look up what that is. Oh, here's an organization that is a democratic socialist organization. I'm going to join. And you said we have 60,000 members. I have to tell you all that we had 500 new DSA members join in the space of just 3 hours today, around in the middle of the day.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. So stay tuned for new membership numbers, I think. But definitely, I think that the Bernie campaign had this huge cohering power, both in 2016 and now. And I think that's also the reason that I think a lot of us are disappointed right now is that it's hard to know or hard to tell exactly what if any institutions are going to continue to have that power to cohere the left and make us all feel like we are part of one singular project sort of pushing in the same direction. So I think it was yes, obviously this dream of Bernie potentially being in the White House. And also the power of that dream to cohere the left, that we're mourning the loss of both of those things today, I think.
So, given what you just said, Marianela, to me that begs a question of what the work of an organization like DSA should be going forward. And I feel like there is a danger that there will be many people. I mean, before Bernie helped revive the socialist movement in the United States, I think it was still really dominated by anarchism, which had been dominant on the American left for several decades. That was how I got politicized when I first became a socialist, like 15 or 17 years ago. And so I'm worried that there will be a number of people on the radical left who point to the fact that Bernie lost for the second time, or people within DSA too, who would say, well, see, look, we tried that electoral stuff and it was a failure. We lost. That was a total waste of time. And now we need to be doing the real stuff. We need to not be fucking around with this bourgeois electoralism anymore after that. So what would your response to somebody like that be?
Well, I think, great question. I think it was never going to be easy. And I think we hear this a lot, and sometimes it just ends there. But I think what that means is that we have to look at examples of both what our comrades in other countries have done in recent history, but we also have to look at, history of those who came before us. And I think it's not enough to just say, okay, we sort of tried it once and now we know that that's a dead end. And I think we have to continue. There's a few things we have to do. I think we have to consolidate on the wins that this last Bernie campaign that we've made through this last Bernie campaign. I think that can mean a few different things. I think that means both redirecting energy into fights like the fight for the Green New Deal, like the fight for Medicare for All, which I think resonates now more than ever, than all of these things that I think we as socialists have been fighting for a really long time. And now I think are more resonant than ever because of the crisis that we're in. And I think we also have to think about, what else we do, and think about, yes, definitely going beyond elections and going beyond a single candidate. And I think that, Micah, that's what you were mentioning earlier, this idea of class struggle elections. And to me, what that means is that we have specific tactics that work to name the enemy, that work to raise the expectations of the working class, that work to agitate people, and that the goal of class struggle elections is not simply to get someone elected, but it's to build working class organization and to put people into motion. And I think that that's what's happened with the Bernie campaign. And I think now it's the responsibility of socialists to continue to consolidate that energy and to continue sort of guiding it. I was reading a few weeks ago this metaphor of, working class energy as kind of like steam in an engine, and it needs the structure of the engine, the pistons, to sort of direct it. And in a lot of ways, that's what organizations do. I think the other piece is that we have to focus on working class organization in workplaces. We have to continue to foment our relationship with the labor movement and continue to grow the labor movement, because nothing is going to be possible. We're never going to be able to win a Green New Deal without an organized and militant labor movement. Same with Medicare for All, and same for all of these things that we're fighting for. And I think as socialists, we know that. And again, I mean, now I'm just talking and I'm starting to feel hopeful as I'm talking. I'm like, okay, wow, actually we've had a lot of little victories along the way, and the task is daunting, but I think we are certainly a lot further along now than even we were a year ago, I think. Right,
which is, it's a key point to make here, that the reason that we are here, where we have a reborn socialist movement and all that stuff, is through principally the engagement with electoral politics. And of course, we all recognize that we need to do other stuff beyond just elections, but it was through engagement in that election, in the presidential election twice, that has led to all of these 60,000 plus members of DSA, and of course the thousands upon thousands that are part of the broader progressive movement and the broader left out there, to come together to be able to fight for a Green New Deal and support strikes and everything else. Eric, you've been on the left for a while, and I assume you had experiences like me of just complete marginalization. I told the story on another podcast the other day, but I went to the Bernie Sanders rally in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it was in the beginning of March, I believe. And I went to college for 2 years in Grand Rapids, and I grew up 45 minutes from it. So I was there very often for 3 or 4 years. And I was involved in anarchist organizing against the war in Iraq in the mid-2000s. And the Bernie rally was in a plaza in downtown Grand Rapids that was right where we used to do food not bombs and anti-war protests and critical mass and all kinds of stuff over the years that I was there. And it would always be like max a dozen of us, 13 of us, 14 of us. And maybe even one time Bush came to town, and I remember there were like maybe 100 to 150 of us. And we thought that was great, like when we could get like 100 people out or something. And at this Bernie rally, the exact place where we were doing these small fringe stuff that never got any attention, there were 7, 8, 9,000 people all gathered, hearing a message of class struggle, hearing some pretty radical rhetoric from the stage. And it just made me think, like, my God, we can't go back to the old way of being marginalized and being kind of sectarian. I mean, we thought we were anti-sectarian at the time, but in hindsight, we came off as a bunch of weirdos to people. We weren't very friendly to others. We weren't really engaged in the stuff of mass politics. And some of that is objective conditions, but other parts of it are subjective. And we have seen through Bernie how we can do some real mass politics here. And I don't think we should go back to the old way of doing marginalized and tiny and sort of subcultural politics. We've seen through Bernie that we can actually build a mass movement on a message of class struggle.
Yeah, I mean, the big question, is how we stay in the political mainstream of American political life. And that's actually, I still think, is sort of miraculous, that you have, that was even possible that Democratic Socialists could be a front runner for the U.S. president is just, we almost take it for granted now. But it's just bonkers if you think about it, really, as far as the trajectory of U.S. history and politics. And so people take that for granted, but we shouldn't. And we should definitely not go back to the margins. And really, I think the way you framed it is right. We need to do mass politics. That doesn't just mean electoral politics. It means that our starting point, to quote a socialist named Vladimir Lenin, was, politics starts with the millions, right? And that's important because our starting point is not the people who already agree with us, but it's people who really are looking for answers and who are at this point not in our existing milieus, right? And who maybe voted for Bernie or maybe didn't vote for Bernie, but are people that might go on strike tomorrow because they're worried about dying from the virus, right? And so I think that when we do politics, our starting point has to be that we have to have confidence in that a majority of people in this country and in other countries of the world can eventually, through their organization and activity, understand their power and understand that they have the ability to radically transform the world. And so the way that looks can be elections, it can be strikes. And I think one of the really exciting things that we've talked about, but it's worth underlining, is the Bernie campaign has already fomented this type of infrastructure and activity. And I'll just give you one example because it's an important one. The organizing right now that DSA is doing in conjunction with United Electrical Workers Union to help workers across the country fight back and organize in response to the pandemic. A lot of that organizing comes out of the infrastructure and relationships we built through the Bernie campaign, right? We met so many labor activists across the country who we'd never been in touch with before. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and we've been doing Bernie work. And we literally just asked the same people, and the same unions were like, well, shit, we got to do something now so we don't die and so that our coworkers and friends don't die. And so you see how already that Bernie campaign was able to translate into what is now actually a very big, robust structure nationally that is helping hundreds of workers organize. And so I think that's really why I'm still hopeful, when I'm not crying at least, is that that infrastructure exists, and it's a question now of continuing it. And I think that the depth of the crisis that we're about to, I think, see even more clearly is going to keep on being an impetus for workers to fight back. And the question is whether we have activists can give political responses and organizational responses to cohere that.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, the organizing that's going on now? Because, you're mentioning this project of DSA helping organize workers along with the United Electrical Workers, and it's not like we're just sitting around trying to figure out what to do. I mean, there are already projects that are in motion, like the one that you're talking about, that seem to be poised to continue this energy and to continue trying to spread that kind of labor militancy at a time when we're in the middle of this pandemic, in which there's nothing more urgent than workers who are at risk of being exposed to COVID-19 shutting down their shops until they get better pay, or certainly at least in like workers like grocery store workers or Amazon workers. Can you talk about what that organizing that exists right now currently looks like and how it is sort of continuing the ethos behind the Bernie campaign?
Yeah, 100%. So the short version is it's called EWOC, Emergency Worker Organizing Committee. And it's a partnership between DSA and UE, the union, in which basically any worker across the country who finds and fills out this form that we're spreading everywhere online, just basically saying, do you need help organizing your workplace in response to the pandemic? They fill that form out, and we get them connected with labor organizers to help them fight back. And we've already made a lot of wins in small shops and some bigger shops. Got big campaigns in places like Amazon, different grocery chains across the country. And I think it's just really a crazy moment. Obviously, that's probably like an understatement. But it's worth highlighting, again, for anybody who's feeling a sense of despair about the Bernie campaign, that as we speak, there is a strike wave going on, right? We don't even know how many workers, because so much of this stuff is just kind of like under the radar, or workers are walking out and not telling the press. They're just doing it because they're scared. But the response of that fear is not to submit to the bosses, but is actually to collectively take action to force them to meet their demands or to force them to shut down. And so we're actually in this moment that's very pregnant with possibilities that I think should give us some hope, not just for the left, but really for a revival of the labor movement, in the way that because you have these strikes, but also because you just see the system exposed for how rotten it is, and also the necessity, I think, for something like Medicare for All is just so obvious to so many people right now. I'm not sure if you all saw, but there was this recent poll where the support for Medicare for All has spiked. So I do think that crises expose systems, and when people are fighting back, that's a very explosive mix. So that's, personally, that's why I wish Bernie had stuck it out longer, because I wanted him to continue using his platform to give an organized, expression to that. But I think that now it's up to us to really try to make sure that people know that there's an alternative and that there's something worth fighting for.
Yeah, just while you brought that up, Eric, can we hear some theories about why Bernie chose to drop out today? It doesn't quite fully make sense to me. He's going to still be on the ballot, I believe, in most states, so that he can continue to collect delegates and then still have an impact at the DNC should it happen. But why? I mean, what are the reasons that you guys are reading either in the tea leaves or through the recent conflict between people in the campaign? Some people in the campaign saying he should continue on despite the math looking very bad for him. Other people in the campaign saying that he should throw in the towel now. And I don't know if the upshot of that is that they should sort of get behind Biden so that we can all try to defeat Trump. But what are the theories for why throwing in the towel at this point specifically? Marianela, I'll start with you.
I don't know that my theories have any connection to actual reality. I just have some general senses of what could have possibly been going on, and potentially, what I would have done if I were in Bernie's shoes, or what I would be thinking or feeling. And I think that, like I was saying earlier, I think the situation in Wisconsin yesterday was really, really dire. And I think the fact that right now, because of the lack of proactive action, both at the federal level and at the state level, in terms of dealing with a pandemic, I think that lack of action has left a lot of states and party leadership just in the dark about how to plan for their primaries. And so there's no clear plan for what's going on, other than, people are going to still be expected or sent out to vote in extremely dangerous and risky conditions. And I think the reality of that makes it so that if you're campaigning for president, you're in this really difficult position of having to ask people to go vote and put their lives at risk, or not do anything at all. And I think, we've seen Bernie over the last several weeks sort of pivot all of his efforts and his energy and sort of his campaign to dealing with the COVID crisis. And perhaps he sort of saw those two things as being at odds, right? Like being able to actually deal with the crisis and acknowledge the reality of it, and asking people to vote for him for president were perhaps at odds with each other. I don't think that's the entire story by any stretch of the imagination, but I imagine that was probably at least one factor. But I know Eric probably has other thoughts.
I don't really have an inside scoop either, to be honest. But my sense is that's basically the case. But that there's also, just to be real, a significant amount of pressure from the Democratic Party establishment and the corporate media for weeks now, trying to say that Bernie, in staying in the race, is somehow abetting Trump, right? So there's just this intense pressure from above, and it's understandable because I think we all do want to see Trump defeated. It's understandable that people in the campaign would, be open to that type of argument. The difficulty is that I do think that there are some illusions in the idea that somehow there is some sort of way of having a line of dialogue with Biden, or, if maybe Biden can change some of his policies, then people, will vote for him. There's this idea that somehow we're still on the same team as the Democratic Party establishment. And I just don't think that's the case. I think it's actually a very good question. What do we do in the upcoming election? I'm sympathetic to people who say, well, maybe, individuals should vote against Trump. That's an open question. You can have that debate. But the idea that somehow we should do anything other than focus on building our independent organization is just a tremendous mistake. It's like everything we've won is because we've been willing to go up against not just the billionaires and the Republicans, but against the Democratic Party itself, to be honest, and the Democratic Party establishment that coheres the Democratic Party. And so going forward, the danger is not just on the one hand like anarchism, but also that there's a certain amount of Bernie supporters that could get sucked into this argument that we shouldn't keep on fighting right now, that everything has to be just subordinated to defeating Trump. And I just don't think that's the case. I think that the first priority really for Bernie supporters right now is to stay organized, is to organize in workplaces and communities around the virus. How you vote in November, I think, is mostly an individual decision at this point. But our organizational focus has to be building independent power against both the Republicans and the Democrats. Because otherwise, we're going to just get, I think, dissolved back into where we were before.
I think that's right. That kind of raises a question of how we keep the new electoral standard bearers of our movement committed to that same level of independence, because obviously Bernie Sanders is this unique individual in American history, perhaps the most stubborn person to ever emerge in American politics, just totally ignores all of the enticements of, or almost totally ignores all of the enticements of American politics. He just sort of has dripping contempt for like all of his contemporaries. He hates everything about the media and our political system and most everything except average working class people. And so he was able to maintain this independence from the Democratic Party his entire career, which is what made him so special. It made it so he was the one who could emerge in this moment. On the other hand, there's been a big debate recently about folks like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of course, and how much she is maintaining independence from the Democratic Party. And there's a kind of back and forth. She's making her peace with the bad establishment Democrats. Then she says, actually, this is just a hit job from mainstream media. But it is true that folks like her don't emerge from, they're not Bernie Sanders, so they don't have that same just level of unique stubbornness. But B, they don't emerge from organizations that can discipline them and that can keep them independent of the Democratic Party apparatus, which is, of course, an argument for, as Eric, you just said, for building DSA. But we already have some people, elected officials who are, even if they're members of DSA, we have no effective means for disciplining them and keeping them independent of the Democratic Party establishment. So I guess, Marianela, what do we do with that? I mean, is the answer just like, well, we need to run our own people in the future who actually are accountable to us, so who will pledge to actually remain independent of the Democratic Party? Or is there anything more there that we need to be doing to keep building that kind of independent force that Eric was talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of accountability is an interesting one. I think we always throw around this word, and it's hard to actually say what really we mean by it. I think it's different than discipline. This idea that like there's a line and it must be stuck to. I think that we're already starting to see certain state Democratic parties push back on DSA members running on their ballot line, even doing things like trying to ban them for participating in all state Democratic Party activities. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And so it's going to become more difficult for us to continue running people on the Democratic Party ballot line. I think that this is, it could end up not being true, but it's a pattern that I'm seeing arise. And I think the other thing is that until we have an independent party, I think that actually represents workers and is made up of workers and is a mass party, we're not going to be able to, in any meaningful way, run and win candidates run candidates and win seats that we reliably know are going to fight on behalf of the working class of this country. All of that said, I think that there's definitely things that we can do sort of in between. I don't think that a party is just around the corner. And one thing that I was thinking while you were talking is that we don't yet really have a critical mass of DSA members or even socialists sort of holding federal legislative seats. And I think that would really be a game changer, right? If we had, just think about, if we had even a handful more people in Congress who could not only sort of mount a visible offense against the Democratic Party establishment, but could also sort of bolster each other and make it feasible to sort of fight that fight without having to have that extreme stubbornness that Bernie has, without having to have that as an inherent part of your character. I think that is something that we as socialists can aspire to. Again, this raises the question of like, how much do we want to continue to invest in elections? Is that a strategy or a tactic that is that's viable for us? Aren't people going to be burnt out? And I think all those are all questions that we need to answer. But I think we have to be realistic about like what the goal is, or what the situation is, which is that the working class does not have a party that represents its interests at all. and move toward the horizon of building that party, while at the same time sort of working within the conditions that we have right now.
Eric?
Yeah, I agree with Marianela. I think that just what I would add is the importance of elections is also on a local and statewide level. And I do think that our ability to start kind of building the types of infrastructures we need is in some ways easier on that level because there's, our organizations don't have to be quite as strong to win some of those races. So there's we can win more. And just the proximity of our elected representatives on a local and statewide level is a little bit closer. And I do think you're going to see a very uneven development of class organization in this country. It's always been that way. And so we should look towards places like New York, California, Nevada, places really anywhere where Bernie did really well, I think is an indicative of that there's something going on, and that actually in some places we already have pockets where we have a majority ready for social democratic socialist politics, and we can be really ambitious. And if we're able to show in a state like California or New York what types of material changes having a strong labor movement in conjunction with elected democratic socialists can do, that's going to be the type of inspiration that I think we're going to need to be able to win a presidential campaign, right? Because that goes back to what we were talking about before, where there's all these people who agree with Medicare for all, but to be honest, think that maybe it's pie in the sky, right? But if we're able to show that electing class struggle candidates with a movement to kind of put a bite behind that can make changes on a local and statewide level, then that's going to raise people's expectations and show that we mean business. And I think ultimately that's how we're going to build a stronger socialist movement. It can't just be on a national level. And so I don't think we should just retreat to local politics, but I do think that one of the answers to people who are a little bit burnt out right now is not just the labor movement, but is from trying to win some of these local and statewide races.
So we've been talking about the Bernie campaign. We've aired our grievances with the end of the Bernie campaign, and it's understandable because a lot of people's feelings right now are pretty raw. And
we haven't even made fun of Mayor Pete yet, though. That's the one thing. I feel like I feel like we can't blame Mayor Pete. I was saying that to somebody earlier today, where I think everything bad in the universe really dates back to the day when Mayor Pete endorsed Biden, and it just set off this avalanche of bad news. Wow. So this is my conspiracy theory.
Too much credit.
No. It's domino theory. Mayor Pete domino theory.
Who cares about him?
Well, who cares about it? We're going to be dealing with this guy for literally decades, for the rest of our lives. He's like our age.
That's extremely upsetting to me.
As long as we're alive, he's probably going to be alive. Oh, ding. Okay. So, all right. Well, Mayor Pete, we got in the dig on Mayor Pete. I mean, who out there really believes that Mayor Pete is not going to run for president in 2024 and 2028 and 2032, just on and on forever. So we got the Mayor Pete ding in, but I wanted to say that I think that we've been talking about a lot of the sort of nitty-gritty details here, but I think that when we look back on the Sanders campaign in the coming years, in the coming decades, or long after the three of us are gone in American politics, I sincerely believe that we are going to look back on Bernie Sanders' two campaigns as really pivotal moments in American politics. I think that whatever happens with Bernie from here on out, I mean, we are not going to see an American politics that sort of reverts to pre-2016. Socialism being laughed out of the room, policies like Medicare for all or free college for everyone not being taken seriously. All of these things I think we're going to just hear more and more and more about, and we're going to see more and more and more growth of the socialist movement. We're going to see more socialist elected officials taking office. I think that we'll look back on these two campaigns as the start of a major shift leftward in American politics after the dominance of neoliberalism that started, a little bit before Ronald Reagan, but then when Ronald Reagan took office, we had that kind of hard right neoliberal politics that are still dominant today in U.S. politics. I'm gonna hereby throw down a prediction that Bernie Sanders is the pivot in American history in a different direction. And if that's true, I think that would put Bernie in the pantheon of great Americans. He would belong up there with Eugene Debs and Thaddeus Stevens and Martin Luther King and name all the great American figures in political history you can think of. I think he'll belong up there.
100%. I mean, I think he already does. I think the role that he has played is historic. And especially when you sort of put it in the context of his whole trajectory, the fact that he, got I think 1.2% in the first election that he ever ran in, and he just kept running and kept losing and kept being really excited, when he this next time he got, I think 2.5%. And so that had doubled the previous results. And that was a huge win for him. I think he's just frankly, an example of a true, like you said earlier, he's one of us. And I think he's an example of a true fighter, and the spirit that we should all embody when we're embarking upon this, which is the fight of our lives. I think we should remember the lessons, not just from 2020, 2016, but learn from Bernie's entire trajectory.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'm a little bit less certain, Micah, but I'm optimistic, which is to say that I think it really depends on what people do, right? So I was listening to Bernie's speech today, and he said, 2 million different people gave money to the campaign. So what those 2 million people right now, tonight, decide to do will in large part, I think, determine that trajectory. Because if those 2 million people keep on organizing and keep on fighting and build off the momentum, then I think what you're saying will be right. But that's important because it's also incumbent upon us as organizers to make sure those 2 million people don't just go home and get demoralized, but keep on fighting. And I think one of the reasons that is a source of optimism is that the campaign was just a really beautiful and powerful experience. I mean, I think that's one of the things that maybe gets lost a little bit in some of the articles and the punditry. But for anybody who's involved in it, it was this very human, moving thing where you just met so many lovely human beings who sacrificed for each other and got nothing, personal out of it other than kind of the joy of struggle and the joy of giving to other people. And it's that ethos, it kind of gives you a gleam of what a better world could be like. And I think that because that touched people, I think in a really kind of personal way, that is a hard thing to take away. So even though people are hurting right now, you kind of get a sense of how humanity could be different and how society could be different. And I think ultimately that's maybe just as important an impact of the Bernie campaign.
Well, onward then to that better society. Hopefully this will be the start of something, not the ending. I very sincerely believe that it is, not just because I want to make myself feel better as I'm shedding tears for the end of Bernie's campaign. I don't know if you guys were watching the live stream when he announced the end of his campaign today, but I was tearing up. That was good. And then I had to edit all of these reflections on his campaign today, and I'm just crying. I'm reading Eric's. Eric's is making me cry. I'm moving on to Megan Day's. I'm crying. It's just they're all making me cry. But it's all the tears are gonna be worth something if we're able to build that bigger movement. So thank you guys for being a part of that movement, and thanks for coming on the podcast to talk about it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Smash capitalism.
That's right. Onward. No surrender.
No regrets.